The name of the talk is Balancing the Costs and Benefits of Learning, and it's about evolving learners and seeing how they can find optimal learning strategies that make them able to retain or to have a good benefit of their learning and still try to avoid the costs of learning as much as possible. Because that's one interesting thing about learning, that it also has a cost that is often not discussed so much. So let's take a look at the background first. So that learning has benefits is obvious to anyone who studied learning. Learning individuals have the ability to adapt to their environment, and they can outperform individuals that don't learn, don't adapt. But that learning also has a cost is something that's not as much studied, but it's also very interesting. Now the costs of learning take on a number of forms. One very obvious cost is the purely energetic cost of learning. For instance, the cost of having a brain that needs a lot of energy. So it's been shown in both biology and in simulated studies that having a brain or having the ability to learn is costly. So if you don't need it, you shouldn't really have it. Another example of this cost is learning from uncertain perceptions. So if the world shows you something that is not really, or that is uncertain at times, you can learn something wrong. And for instance, learn that you should start eating poisons instead of foods. So it's better to be hardwired to have the correct behaviors from birth. Also, the cost of exploration is an example of this. For instance, as a child, one explores one's environment, but as an adult, one tries to stay more stable and not explore so much, thereby avoiding potential dangers. So one piece of background that I need to introduce for this all to make sense is what's called the Baldwin effect. And maybe some of you have heard of it, but I'll introduce it for those who haven't. Now, the Baldwin effect is an effect we see in populations going through an evolutionary process, which enables this population to go from having a trait that they have to learn to have plastic at some point, to in a later generation having this trait become part of their genotype, an innate trait. This is not possible through any direct effects, but through an indirect effect, this can happen on the population level. Now, if we consider a population on the bottom left here that is somewhat unadapted to their environment, they're having a low fitness and a low plasticity. Now, as generations pass by, those individuals that are more plastic will typically win out because they are able to adapt to their environment. So the more plastic individuals get a benefit from being plastic, and they can outperform the others. And the average fitness will rise. That's phase one, where the benefit of plasticity increases plasticity and increases fitness. Now, as most of the population is pretty plastic and pretty well adapted to their environment, those individuals that are already from birth born with the ability that makes them survive well in this environment, they will win out because they don't have to pay this cost of being plastic. They don't have to learn the behavior, they have it from birth, and so their fitness increases even more. And in this way, those individuals that don't pay this cost of plasticity profilate in the population, and the average plasticity is reduced. And what happens here is then that this trait that once had to be learned has now become part of the genotype in the population, basically. So it's phase two here that I'm most interested in, and it's sometimes referred to as genetic assimilation, because it describes the process where a trait that is at one time part of a plastic trait, something that's learned in the population, becomes part of the genotype at a later point, leading to a reduced overall plasticity. Another effect that is related to this in some way is what's called sensitive periods. So my next talk is going to have a lot more about sensitive periods. Sensitive periods is an effect that we see in both animals and humans, where learning of specific behaviors is located in a small part of an individual's life. We see this in a lot of behaviors in both humans and animals. So for instance, visual learning, most of it happens in a very short period in life. Forming food preferences, it happens in a short period of our life. And this of course has a very clear evolutionary advantage in that we can learn something early in life and then stay stable and sort of exploit that behavior later in life, avoiding this cost of learning, while still retaining the benefits of learning by having learning exactly when it's needed. So this is seen in nature, and we can also see it in a lot of simulations if we allow it to happen. And so my question then was, how does this relate to this Baldwin effect? So if we look at the Baldwin effect and sensitive periods, or they're also sometimes called critical periods, we see that they have some common traits. They both limit the plasticity of individuals. In the case of sensitive periods, they limit the plasticity by putting plasticity or learning only in the time of life when it's most needed and staying stable outside it. In the case of the Baldwin effect, they reduce plasticity by removing plasticity completely for a behavior and encoding it into the genotype. And this, of course, has the effect of retaining the benefits of being plastic while reducing the cost. But they're not studied together often. I think I've never seen them studied together. And the reason is that we most of the time study them on different time scales. The Baldwin effect we study mostly across generations, looking at how the plasticity evolves across generations, how genetic assimilation happens across generations. Whereas the critical periods we usually studied within a generation. So we look at one individual, see that he learns a lot early in life and stays stable for the rest of his life, for instance. So what I wanted to do was try to find some way to study these two methods or these two effects together to see how they relate to one another. And to do that, I set up this this hypothesis that we have, if we study a range of environmental stability. Now, environmental stability is simply my way of balancing the cost and benefits of learning. So a very stable environment typically it doesn't have a very high benefit of learning. So the cost-benefit ratio is low. Whereas a somewhat unstable environment has a high benefit of learning. You need to learn to stay adaptive. And therefore the cost-benefit ratio is quite high. So now I wanted to set up this range of environmental stability and evolve learners throughout this range and see what sort of strategies do they evolve. And then I wanted to see if I can see the relationship between the genetic assimilation we typically see in the Baldwin effect and these sensitive periods that we have also observed in biology. So my hypothesis was this. If we look at the full range of environmental stability, from the most unstable environment we can imagine to the most stable environment we can imagine, we will see these different strategies. For a fully stable environment, I pictured we will see no learning evolve because the genotype can handle all the changes. For a constantly changing environment, similarly, I imagined we would see no learning evolve because it's really changing so fast that learning has no utility. As soon as something is learned, it's useless. For an intermediate range, and also others have hypothesized this, for an intermediate range of learning, we will see, of stability, we will see learning evolve. And if we start from a fully stable environment and move to the left here, I hypothesized we would see somewhere we would reach the limit of genetic assimilation. To the right of this, the genotype can handle the changes in the environment, but as we increase the instability more and more, we will see that learning has to take over as the way to adapt, because things are changing too fast. And at first then I hypothesized we would see these sensitive periods, where a short period of learning the trait early in life could be enough. And then as we make the environment more and more unstable, I hypothesized we will see lifelong plasticity, because the environment is not changing so much that we need to readapt throughout life. So this was my hypothesis of how different learning strategies will evolve in different rates of environmental change. So how did I set up my experiment for this? I used an experimental setup that was developed by Todd and Miller, and I adapted it a little bit to be able to study environmental change across this range. So Todd and Miller and also me imagine this underwater creature that is born into one spot and stays there for the entirety of its life. And in this spot, constantly foods and poisons are floating by. And let's say the foods are green, the poisons are red. But the individual doesn't know what's the food and poison until it's tried them out and been able to form preferences. Now if we, at some time, take away these foods and poisons and insert completely new foods and poisons, the individual will have to readapt to be able to do well in this environment. And this allows us to have a very simple setup where we can adapt just one parameter to say how big is the variability in the environment, so how big is the change rate in the environment. And this parameter I call the stability period, and I regulate it from 0.02 to 200. 200 in this case means there are 200 generations between each environmental change. And for me, I use 200 generations of evolution. That means that the environment was the same throughout evolution. 0.02 means the environment changes every 0.02 generations. In this case, this means it changes 50 times per generation. That was found to be so fast that no learning was evolved because things were happening too fast for learning to follow it. So this allows me to explore the full range of environmental stability here. So Giles Maley in 1996, discussing experiments on genetic assimilation, said that we need two things in our experiment. We need, first of all, genetically controlled plasticity, because the evolution should be able to remove plasticity and encode things in the genotype instead. And we need learned characteristics to be possible to express genetically, because that's what happens in genetic assimilation. At first we have something that's plastic, they're encoded into the genotype, and we can express them genetically. So I set up as simple as an agent model as I could with these two properties. And it looks something like this. So we have a very simple neural network that is reinforced by neuromodulated learning here. So these are neuromodulators. I won't go so much into detail on what they do. We can talk about it later if you want. But what happens, simply put, is that when we get a reward, we are reinforced to keep eating that kind of substance that floats by. When we get a punishment, we're reinforced to try to stay away from it. And so when the environment changes, then this has to be relearned. So the old associations are useless when we change the environment. Evolution's job in this case was both to set the weights of the system, so it could form the innate preferences of the system, and to set the learning rate of the system. So it can select how much is left up to plasticity to learn. And also, as a note, it could affect the learning rate as a function of the age of the agent. So it could select how much do you learn early in life, later in life, and so on. So it can form these sort of sensitive periods, a short period of plasticity, if that is beneficial for the agent. Here's the evolutionary parameters, pretty standard, I won't go so much into detail. Just want to mention I run two types of experiments here. One that I call dynamic experiments, and these are the experiments where learning rate is allowed to vary over the age of the agent. And one that I call the static experiments, and that's where I have a fixed learning rate for the whole life of the agent. But still it's evolved. So it evolves a fixed learning rate or a age-dependent learning rate. And of course I need a lot more parameters to encode the age-dependent learning rate. Finally, I want to mention about learning costs. You'll hear more about this if you stay for my next talk. Learning costs are well documented from biology and also from simulated studies like this. If we had a more complex setup, the learning costs would be implicit in some way in the setup. But since my setup is so simple, I add an explicit learning cost, simulating this cost of learning that we see in nature. So that in this way, the individuals have to balance the benefit of learning versus the cost of learning. And if we didn't have this sort of explicit learning cost here, they would just maximize their learning always. A more complex setup would have this cost implicitly. Okay, my results. Now, this the x-axis here shows the stability period of the environment. So let's focus on the solid curve for now. The x-axis is the stability period. On the right we have a completely stable environment. On the left we have a completely changing environment, or completely dynamic. So it changes too fast to be able to learn. And what we can identify is that there are some sort of range where learning is evolved. For the most unstable and the most stable environments, no learning is evolved, or very low levels of plasticity occur. Whereas for intermediate ranges, we see this sort of heap of plasticity evolve. And we can also maybe see two sort of different strategies, we'll see more of that. But we see that for the most unstable environment, there seems to be more of an investment in learning than in the less stable environments. In the less stable environments, there's more of an investment than in the more stable ones. And we can see why this happens. These plots show the generations of evolution on the x-axis and the age of an individual on the y-axis, from a newborn individual on the top to an old one on the bottom. And from A to F here, we see more and more stable environments. So environments where stuff is stable and we don't really need to learn throughout life. And what we see evolve here is, for the most unstable environment, we see learning evolve that persists throughout life, as shown by the uniformly black plots here. Whereas as for the more stable environment, we see learning that is basically in the earliest years of the agent's life, and that then falls off at the end of life, to avoid paying this cost of learning later in life, while retaining the benefits of having adaptations sometime in life. And they put it early in life, of course, to be able to use what they learned for the rest of their life. So this sort of shows this sensitive period effect that we also see in a lot of animals. And we see that in this case, around 1 change per generation is sort of the turning point, where we go from having a strategy of learning throughout life to learning just early in life. And we can see this results in a more condensed form in such a plot as this, where it's also compared to my hypothesis. We see the stability period here on the x-axis, ranging from completely unstable on the left to completely stable on the right. The age on the y-axis, from newborn in top to old in the bottom, and the color says how much they invest in learning. Now on the left and right flank here, we see very white columns, indicating that for the most stable and most unstable environments, there's not really any learning involved. For intermediate ranges, we see a heap of learning, and we see some uniform gray columns here for the most unstable of these environments, meaning that the individuals here evolved to adapt throughout life, because the environment is so unstable. Whereas for the more stable ones, we see this sort of separation between an early period of adaptation and a later period of staying stable. And this corresponds sort of to the 4 strategies that I hypothesized. Now, to see what is the effect of these sensitive periods, or this age-dependent learning rate, I studied dynamic individuals having this age-dependent learning rate, compared them with static individuals that had a constant learning rate throughout life. And I wanted to see what's the difference between their evolved strategies. Now, one thing we can see is that these dynamic learners, they fall off, or they're much more smoothly regulated. So they're not either in learning mode or non-learning mode, but they can be somewhere in between, which is natural because they can adjust throughout life. Another thing I wanted to see was the fitness of these individuals. So the fitness is here on the y-axis, the stability period on the x-axis, from completely unstable to completely stable, and we see the evolved solutions here. And we see that the left plot here shows the situation just before an environmental change. So that means that the individuals now have gone a few generations where they have adapted to their environment, and we look at their fitness. And we see that in this case, dynamic individuals show a much higher fitness for stability periods just around this range where we saw sensitive periods evolve. And that means that they were able to reduce their cost of learning by having these sensitive periods, thus resulting in a higher fitness for these strategies. Now, if we look at the situation on the right, this is the situation in the next generation, the generation right after an environmental change. And here we see that the dynamic individuals outperform the other ones in all cases. And the reason why they do that, as I will show you some more support for, is that they were able to retain more of their learning capacity because they don't have to pay this high cost of learning. Whereas these static individuals pay a very high cost of learning because they're plastic their whole life, so they have to rely on genetic assimilation instead of staying plastic. And this makes their fitness much lower in the generation after the change because they can't learn. And we can see this in a more standard fitness plot like this. So what we see here is, a fitness plot. So this is just a normal GA fitness plot, but it's periodic because I changed the environment with a given period. On the left, a period of 20, on the right, a period of 50. And we see here that the static individuals that can't regulate learning rate throughout life suffer much more in these generations where the change is happening. And the reason is they cannot retain their learning because they pay such a high cost of it, that they have to shut off learning and rely on the genotype to handle the changes. So that when the change comes, they can't respond as well to it because they don't learn. So, to conclude, we studied learning across a range of environmental change and saw strategies evolve, 4 strategies really, or 3 maybe. On the edges, no learning. In between, we saw learning, both in the form of sensitive periods and in the form of constant learning throughout life. And we saw that this sensitive period, by making learning less costly, they can make individuals stay open for plasticity, stay open for learning in relatively stable environments. And that means that they can handle changes also in these environments. And then we see the link between sensitive periods and genetic assimilation, in that the sensitive periods really prevent the genotype from assimilating learned characteristics because it allows individuals to stay plastic for a longer time. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Question?
Yeah.
I have a question about this cost of learning.
Yeah.
Surely, so when you get this right, so there would be a cost of learning anyway, because if you're learning, then sometimes you explore, right? Sometimes you're trying to do something that you think actually you're not going to do.
Yeah. That's true.
So there is that cost.
Yeah, actually, that is true. That would be a tiny cost in this case, though.
So you have to add an additional cost.
Yeah, in this case, I have to, if not, all individuals will stay very plastic throughout life.
Okay, so
typically.
can you give us any intuition as to what level of cost you should, at what level don't you have to add this sort of artificial cost of learning?
Yeah, that's interesting. It doesn't have to be a very much more complex level. Actually, my next talk I will give an example of it because I have 2 talks in a row. But no, but I want to get into it a bit now. So John Bolinaria, who is the one that I will cite in my next talk, doing this, he had a very simple setup where he simulated the oculomotor system of the eye, the system that controls movements of the eye. And all he had to do in his system was have some uncertainties, and he found that the cost of learning was then high enough to drive plasticity to be low in adult individuals, as we saw. So it doesn't have to be super advanced. Thanks.
I was wondering, your discussion.
Yeah.
Just the term of all the ECAL agents.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that.
Or the red stuff.
Yeah, it's the sum of food eaten minus the sum of poison eaten.
And then also you take into account learning cost for the size of the
Yeah.
network.
That's the learning cost is part of the fitness too. That's subtracted from the fitness. It's not the size. The network is always the same. The learning cost is just the sum of the plasticity that is evolved. Let's see. Take a look at one of the graphs. Yeah, these graphs are maybe a bit hard to read, but in general, if there's a lot of black here, it would have a high learning cost because it does a lot of learning. So it's just summing up the learning it does in every age of its lifetime, multiplied by constant.